Welcome to In the News for April the 7th, 2023. I am Brett Burney from appsandlaw.com.
And this is Jeff Richardson from iPhone JD. Good morning, Brett.
Good morning, Jeff. It's good to see you as always. And wow, some great posts today. Why don't we start off with I feel like I shouldn't have nice squishy feelings about CEOs of very large, powerful companies.
But you can't help it here.
When it comes to Tim Cook, I just can't help but really like the guy. And so what I'm referencing is GQ, the magazine GQ, had a fantastic story that you linked to today on Tim Cook, a little profile, if you will. And it's just great. So many neat little things in here about Tim Cook.
It's a great story. The author, Zach Barron, is someone who I'm not familiar with, but he clearly knows Tim Cook. He's interviewed him in the past, and he knows what he's all about. And it's not just a fluff interview. It actually gets into some interesting issues, but it paints an interesting profile. I mean, like you say, Tim Cook really strikes me as the sort of man, he's just very calm. He's very, incredibly smart. But, it's fascinating to me that I think that Steve Jobs was the right person for Apple in the beginning, and also when he came back in the 90s for so many reasons. And yet Steve Jobs was infamous for being, temperamental and, going off the handle and crazy remarks. Tim Cook is the opposite personality, and yet he was clearly the right person to turn Apple into, the biggest company in the world. So it's a great article. One of my favorite little pieces is there's a story about Tim Cook that's been infamous that I never knew if it was actually true. But the story was that they were having a meeting with a bunch of executives, and which one I'm going to say. And one of the executives mentions an issue that's going on in China. And so Tim Cook just, very calmly says, okay, so we need to address that. And then he goes on with the meeting. And then about 20-30 minutes later, he notices, and the guy that he was mentioning, he's like, oh, you're still here? And the guy's like, so he just runs off to the airport, jumps on a plane to China without packing a bag or anything like that, and goes and just fixes the problem.
There it is.
And so they confirmed that is a true story. And in fact, the guy that in question, who's named in the article, he's like, oh, he's still at Apple. He's the head of, this big division.
He's running all of operations today. That's what he says. Exactly.
So, but it's just sort of a very calmly like, I expect you to go. And that story is infamous because it seems like Tim Cook comes across as like very demanding, like, you should be there immediately. But when he refers to it here, she's very calm about it. She's just like, it's a problem to be fixed. That story makes sense because Apple infamously, I guess they still do this. They have on some airline, they pre-book like flights throughout the day, every day. So like they already have all these flights booked. And so because they go back and forth to China so much because of the manufacturing, and I don't know if it's still true today, but like, if you just need to go to China at 3 in the afternoon, you just take one of those already pre-purchased tickets and assign your name to it, and you're good to go. So it's literally possible to do what that story described. But so that and a whole bunch of other stories. And of course, he's not going to talk too much about what Apple has planned in the future. No. And yet, even so, he sort of talks around things like the goggles and stuff like that. Yeah. So it's really sometimes profiles like this are like, whatever. But this one, if the topic interests you at all, I think it's a good one. It really is.
I just enjoyed a little bit more of like the personal reflections. We all know, if we follow Tim Cook for a long time, that he's very personal, very private. But just a couple of little glimmers in here were just kind of neat, to kind of give you a little bit of a scene behind the veil, as it were. Just the fact that the interviewer here talks about how even though Tim Cook has an Apple Watch, and obviously there's lots of people around, they're in the cafeteria of the loop there, the spaceship, but Tim Cook keeps eye contact with him at all times. Like he's not distracted. Like he's really focused on talking with you. And just the fact what he talked a little bit, Tim talked a little bit about when he came and interviewed with Steve Jobs. I know the story's been told in several other places, but it was just kind of neat, listening to Tim, that he was in a bit of a funk, he says, in the little video that follows this interview. And he came and talked to Steve, and he just could tell like something was different about Steve. Like he had a burning desire to come and work for this man. And then just later on, just quickly, I'm going to say, I forget her name. She came from the EPA to Apple. It was kind of further down here. And she was just talking about the fact how when she talks to Tim Cook, like she's in charge of Apple's environmental initiatives, right?
Yes.
That he's very serious in what he does. I'm trying to remember exactly where it was here that she was talking about it, but it was just a reflection of like even the executives underneath Tim, like they know that he's sort of soft spoken, like you referred to. They know that he cares about the people. He looks you in the eye. He talks with you, but when he needs to, he can be very firm and he can be very stern and just making sure like let's get this job done. Just really neat some of those insights here.
It was Lisa Jackson, who's the head of the environmental initiatives.
Yes,
she's actually from New Orleans, like I am, so that's sort of fun.
Oh, nice.
But former head of the EPA, and you mentioned the privacy stuff. Tim Cook obviously is very much respects privacy, and that's a big part of what Apple is, and it's a big distinguishing factor between Apple and many other tech manufacturers that they try to sell your personal information, whereas Apple has a different business model. But for that very reason, it was interesting that he commented upon when he made the decision to come out as being a gay man, and why that normally is not something that he would talk about, but that because he knew that many people, who were younger and struggling with their own identity, he thought it might make an impact for them, and so he made an exception to his general rule. I thought that was interesting. It's a really great article, and like you said when you started the podcast, you can't finish reading the article without just sort of having a smile on your face about what a nice person he is and what an effective person he is. I mean, he's been an incredible leader for Apple. So it's so nice to have someone. It's not like Elon Musk. It's not craziness. It's just calm, collected, good person.
I just want Tim to be my uncle. Number one, because he talks about, his wealth is going to go to his nephew, for college. And number two, it's just like, I would just like to be in the room with Tim Cook. Like, I just want to be around him, like, on the holidays and just hang out with Tim Cook, for those reasons. Now, when did CarPlay come into play, Jeff? Did CarPlay get introduced under Tim Cook's leadership, which by the way was since 2011? I can't remember when CarPlay came out officially. Because another story that you linked to here, a couple of things, really made me mad. We've talked about CarPlay many times, but apparently this past week, one car manufacturer, I was going to let them be unnamed, but
no, they should be.
I'm going to name them. GM plans to phase out Apple CarPlay in their EVs or electronic vehicles, which I guess I can understand why if a car manufacturer wants to have their own operating system. But here, it looks like they're going to the other side. They're going to partner up with Google. I want to hear your thoughts on this first, Jeff, but this does not make me happy.
Yeah, before CarPlay, there was something back in the days of the iPod. There was a technology called iPod Out that a couple of cars had, which was sort of like put an iPod screen in your car.
Yes,
but then it morphed into CarPlay around 2008, 2009. So it's now been not quite 15 years, 13 years of CarPlay. But it's definitely, obviously, any of us that have used it know where it is today. What GM has announced is instead of using CarPlay, it is a Google technology, but it's not that they're picking Google. Right now, most screens that work with CarPlay will also work with the Android system too, which is called Android Auto. It's not that they picked Android Auto over Apple CarPlay. Okay. What they've done is they've Google and the Android is going to do sort of the lower level stuff, but all the interface is going to be done by GM. They're going to be controlling what the apps are and everything else. So it's going to really be their own system. And that's the thing is like, this used to be the problem in the past is the built-in, I mean, all of us know, if you have any sort of a modern car that's come with a navigation system, that the day that you pulled it off the lot, that was the last day it ever really got an update, right?
Right.
And it's, it never changes from them. Whereas the nice thing about CarPlay is, although perhaps I could update more frequently, I'd be happy with that. But it does update from time to time with new features. And as you get new apps on your iPhone that, didn't even exist before, now suddenly you love to use Overcast to listen to your podcast or something like that. Yep. You can use that on CarPlay as well. Whereas the chance in my mind of GM or frankly, any car manufacturer keeping up to date with all of that stuff. I mean, they're not a tech company. This is not what they do. And so I think that they are, GM has a history with the OnStar system of, selling you services for the car. And I'm sure they see this as a way to, continue to get money from people after you sell the car, then you continue to sell them services afterwards. But I think that a lot of people are going to be upset about this. And I think a lot of people are not going to buy GM cars. And it's a shame because, GM with their Volt was one of the first good electric cars that are out there. And I'm sure it has a bright future in the electric car industry. But I think people are going to look at this and compare it to alternatives that are being offered by, Honda or Toyota and stuff like that in the future. And they're going to say, why would I get the one without the CarPlay when I could get the one with the CarPlay? And they're not going to even do that. My wife was just telling me last night when we were talking about this story that lots of times when she will go up to New York to see her mom and she rents a car, through Hertz, she has a thing that you just basically can go into like a big area and pick whichever car you want type thing, right? And if she opens up a car door and it doesn't have CarPlay, she closes the car door up again and goes on to the next one because you want to be able to use your iPhone and your navigation.
Absolutely.
And so we'll see how GM does with this. Obviously it's their decision what to do, but I think that a lot of people are going to vote with their purchasing decisions and not purchase GM vehicles because of this. So, we'll see maybe in a couple of years. It wasn't that many years ago that GM was actually touting that they had the most cars with CarPlay. Right. And now it's just the opposite. So, let's put a bookmark in this story and come back to it in about, obviously these are still future cars that they're working on, but 5 years from now, I'd be curious to see if GM sticks with this decision. I suspect that they won't.
You may take this with a grain of salt because I am no automobile industry expert, but I'm going to say right now, this will be a flop because exactly for the things you're talking about, Jeff. Nothing against GM's cars. Stick to your cars. I mean, make great cars. I'm okay. But exactly what you were just talking about there, I have seen car interfaces, electronic interfaces in the past. And I do the exact same thing that your lovely wife does. In fact, I just rented a car this past week. And I went to the exact same thing, Jeff. I went to like 3 different cars, making sure that not only did they have CarPlay available, but I wanted one with the largest screen available. Because I got to tell you now, in our latest Subaru that we just got as a family, it is like a screen that's probably at least maybe 8 or 10 inches tall, if that makes sense. So it shows a lot more information than most of the screens, which I would say maybe about 4 or 5 inches tall, if that makes sense. Well, the rental car that I had was only the small one. And I got to tell you, I got very used to that larger screen because it showed more of the information.
Yeah, for navigation and stuff, that's great.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I want a bigger screen. I want a Tesla-sized screen, which, by the way, I know that Tesla was mentioned in this because they are famously not supporting CarPlay on this. I don't have a Tesla right now. Maybe that's one of the reasons why. But just quickly, another quick story. My wife just recently had to get our Subaru worked on. So she got a Chevrolet Tahoe as a rental car while it was being worked on. Guess what it did not support? There was no CarPlay. And it was the most frustrating, annoying experience, Jeff. I'm telling you, because we didn't even want to have the screen on. I don't trust that navigation system on there. I like having my Google Maps. I know Apple Maps is just as good in some cases, but I trust Google Maps. We've talked about this before, but I like having the assurance, the confidence that my Google Maps is going to be constantly updated through my iPhone because I trust that, as opposed to whatever the navigation system might be within whatever vehicle. And we're not alone in this. You link to another story from The Verge entitled, "Everybody Hates GM's Decision to Kill Apple CarPlay and Android Auto for its EVs." And I know GM executives are quoted in here as saying, hey, they just haven't seen our new system yet, but you've tried it before. I think they mentioned a Q system, CUE, in here before. They've tried it before. It didn't go well. I just
Ford
don't
tried
understand.
it before too. Remember years ago, Ford, I think it had a name that I forget. It was Ford Auto, but they had their own system and they completely abandoned it after a few years. So that's just not what car people do. But we'll see what happens.
I'll get off my soapbox. I'm making the prediction. I don't do a lot of predictions, but I predict this will flop and they'll eventually go back to Apple CarPlay because in my mind, that's that experience. I don't care what rental car, what car I get in. I want to have that same experience based on my iPhone today in CarPlay because I know exactly where everything is and I know how to use it there. I don't want to jump into a different operating system every car. Okay, I promised I was going to stop, and then I kept talking. Let's talk about happier times. The iPad is now a teenager.
There you go.
The
13
iPad
years old.
is 13 years old. That is just unbelievable. We talked about Tim Cook, and one of the last things in 2010 that Steve Jobs went on stage to announce, in fact, I've got my background here, was the iPad. And I love this slide behind me. He talked about everybody has a computer already. Of course, they wanted it to be a Mac. Everybody already has a mobile phone. Of course, they want it to be an iPhone. And they were asking this question. I remember I see it. I almost memorized the speech. Steve Jobs says, we were wondering if there was a place between those two devices for a third category of a product. And that's when the iPad drops down on a keynote slide, and it has like the smoke comes around. It's just beautiful. And sure enough, he was right. I remember he sat down on that stage, Jeff, in a leather chair, which was kind of unusual for Steve Jobs, right? And he held the iPad in his hand, and he was surfing the internet in his hand on a beautiful, big, large slab of glass. I remember that very fondly. And wow, it hasn't stopped since.
And, that was just that one decision, and the fact that you remember it. And of course I do too, to instantly put the idea in people's hands of, put the idea in people's brains of, you might sit on a couch and just hold your iPad, much like you would hold a book or something like that. And, instantly be like, you just show that one picture and like, okay, now I get it. Now I get how the iPad fits between the computer and between the phone, which you're running around with and is completely mobile. Did you get it? Did you get an iPad that first year, Brett, or when did you first get your iPad?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Me too. I waited a little bit, and then before the end of the year, I'm like, there's too much here. And
I knew it.
And again, it's I as much as I love the iPhone and I have a website called iPhone JD, in some ways my iPad is more. I mean, how do you choose between your children? You never can. But
you should get iPad JD as well, just to make sure.
There you go. I do have that. If you go to iPadjd.com, that
does work.
Okay, it'll bring you right there. But if there's just something about the iPad that's just so special, and it's always been such a great idea. Just a nice big flat screen that you can have the pictures on and do what you want. So happy birthday to the iPad.
I quickly say a few other things. As we have said in many other Apple products, the iPad was not the first, quote, tablet device. Now, they talk in this article about the Windows Surface, which I've always argued that the Surface is not a tablet. It is a Windows computer first that you can remove the screen from, right? Because you can run full Windows.
I agree.
Okay. So, but little do people remember, I find, I wrote about this in 2003, that Microsoft had the Windows XP tablet edition. It was the Windows XP tablet PC, which was similar to what the Surface is today, but they were much more clunky and much bigger. But it was supposed to be a tablet. Now, Microsoft kind of had that same idea. They released tablet PCs in the wild in the early 2000s, but it didn't go so well because it by the name that I said earlier, you can see it was running Windows XP. So it wasn't built for fingers. It was built for a mouse and cursor. And one of the things that I always thought was brilliant, in that same day, the presentation that Steve Jobs introduced the iPad, he famously said, you can use the iPad with just your finger. You don't need a stylus. You don't need a keyboard. You don't need a mouse. Now, what I find interesting is that 13 years later, Apple pretty much supports all of those. In fact, they sell an Apple Pencil, right? They sell a keyboard for the iPad, and they support Bluetooth mice on the iPad. So that's just been an interesting, kind of a wave to see how Apple has sort of, I guess, acknowledged that maybe Steve wasn't exactly on point. But I knew then when the iPad was introduced, because I'd been watching sort of this industry, with the tablet PC for so many years, I knew that was going to be something that Apple was just going to take off and just run with it, because they've done that before. They did that with the iPod after the first MP3 players. They did that with the iPhone, obviously. Anyway, just kind of neat to read this story, and I'll make sure that we link to it as well. From the iPad, let's go back to the iPhone and talk about cases. For the iPhone. That doesn't sound like very exciting, but I love this article.
Do you have a case in your iPhone right now?
You know what? I do. I've always subscribed to having a case. Although, Jeff, I always go to the slimmest case that I can have. Really, because it's not so much from a protection standpoint. Well, I guess it is, in the sense that I just don't want scratches.
Yeah.
Like when I turn in my phone or resell my phone or give it to someone else, I just don't want it to be scratched up. So really, I always try to get the thinnest case for my iPhone that I can, just so that it doesn't scratch. Although I never put a screen protector on it, by the way. I've never done that. But I love this article that you linked to from John Gruber at Daring Fireball, which made me think both ways, although I think I'm sticking with my case.
Yeah, I mean, he did a little survey of people and found, but sort of like of the very small population that he surveyed, rather, it was like a third had a case, a third use an Apple case, and a third use a third-party case. So 2/3 of people were using cases. The cases were sort of split because, I've always enjoyed the Apple cases because they're nice, but they're more expensive. Yes, as I mentioned in my post today, I do have the Apple leather case. I just don't use it very often. It's nice because obviously it makes it less slippery in my hand. I'll often use it if I'm traveling and I just want want to make sure it doesn't slip out of my hand as I'm getting on an airplane or something like that.
Right.
But for everyday use, I just prefer to make it as small and thin and slick as possible, that I can slip it in and out of my pocket of my shirt. And so I realize it's a little dangerous, that I could drop it. I don't see any scratches on my iPhone right now, but who knows?
But who knows?
If I do end up with any, and I end up passing it down to my one of my teenagers, and they have to get an iPhone that's got a scratch on it, so be it.
Right.
It doesn't bother me quite
I do remember, maybe John Gruber linked to this. There was some interview. It was like Tim Cook, Steve Jobs, and somebody else on stage. They were sitting on stools. You know what I'm referring
to?
And
most of them did not have cases. Yeah,
exactly. Somebody it was like a group of journalists, and they were asking questions. And one said, do you have a case on your iPhone? I think that was during the antenna gate or something like that, maybe around that time.
I think you're right.
Yeah, I don't think any of the Apple executives, they all pulled out their iPhones, and none of them had cases on there. Mm-hmm. And again, I just kind of cringed a little bit. I've just always been on that side of like, well, I just want to have it just so that it doesn't scratch, because I know inevitably it's going to drop at some point. Something's going to scratch up when I flip it in and out of my pocket or something. Now, I've always gone with like the thin, either the silicone or even like the plastic. But John Gruber links to a couple of leather cases here that look really, really nice. I've just never gone to the leather side on there. But
yeah, and what I like about this leather case that he links to, who's the name of the manufacturer? Bull Strap.
Bull Strap, yes.
Yeah. The Apple one, the leather covers the entire sides, the top, the sides, and the bottom. But Apple used to, years ago, have the leather case that was completely open at the bottom, which is the way that this one is too. And I have to admit, there was something that was sort of nice about that. I mean, not that you, with the Apple case, you can get a lightning cord in there, but sometimes, and I don't use a lot of them nowadays, but there were times in the past where I might have like a third-party lightning accessory that wouldn't quite fit in the hole on the Apple leather case. Whereas if you have a case like the one that he recommends that has nothing on the bottom of it, it might be easier to use accessories. Again, though, I don't really plug things into my iPhone that often anymore. So, but it looks like an interesting alternative if you like the leather cases. There are so many of them available on Amazon and everywhere else. Obviously, it's just crazy.
This is the first time, actually, by the way, on my iPhone 14 Pro that I did get an Apple case, and I did very much like that about his article, because the Apple case does not have that the case doesn't wrap around the very bottom. And John Gruber,
so it is open at the bottom. Yeah,
it is open at the bottom. And I liked what John Gruber says. I didn't even notice it until he mentioned it, because we're constantly swiping up from the very bottom, right, to go to the home screen or something like that.
Yeah.
And whereas I just
my leather
thought
Apple
about
case
it.
Doesn't have that. So it is a little obnoxious as you swipe up from the bottom on my Apple leather case, unlike the one that you have. Yeah.
Nice link from our friend David Sparks over at MacSparky.com. I knew that David had talked about this dark noise app in the past, but I'm glad that you linked to it, because I don't think that I had it. I may have tried it before, but I'm glad to know there's an update on it now.
Yeah, this is one of these apps that have sort of the background white noise that a lot of people like. Dark noise has been around for a long time, and although this is not something that I use, I know that people that do use it really, really love it. So if having background noise is something that's of interest to you, he just has a couple paragraphs on why the 3.0 version that just came out is even better than ever. So something to keep in mind if this might interest you.
I like how I'm going to send this to a friend who recently told me that he actually suffers from tinnitus, and I think that's interesting, because in this post from David, he says the reason that David uses the dark noise app is that he suffers from tinnitus, which means that he hears a high pitch ringing in his ears constantly. I've never had that or experienced that. I can only imagine how frustrating it is. But knowing David now, that he's very into making sure that his well-being and making sure he's got the tools that he needs to take good care of himself. It just makes me a little bit more sensitive to that. Like, I'm glad that he has found something that can provide some depth background noise to kind of help him, throughout the day, as opposed to having that hearing that in his ears all the time. And by the way, both you and I know David has perfect pitch. So he says that pitch ringing in his ears is a minor third interval between my two ears. He knows exactly what it is. He's a piano player just like yourself, Jeff. It's really nice there. Okay, let's see what do we have next?
Too, I think he plays, but
That's right. Yeah, he likes the jazz aspect. That's great. Thanks for linking to that. Crash detection. Apparently, we've got some different directions. If your phone should accidentally call emergency services if you're not in a crash. Can you explain this to us, Jeff?
Yeah, it's a very simple tip, and Apple updated their webpage, I'm sure because it happened by accident. You know, if the Apple iPhone, or if you have a newer model of an iPhone or a watch, and it senses that you have been in a crash, which it senses because of the rapid change and acceleration and stuff like that, you will have something on the screen that says, hey, it looks like you've been in a crash, and there's sort of a countdown timer, and you've got 20 seconds to say, you know, I'm fine or whatever. But if you don't do anything, then your iPhone or your watch is going to be concerned. Hey, they're not responding. Maybe like this is a dangerous crash that they need to call,
and
911. And that's
we
exactly
reported on stories where that saves people. Exactly.
Yeah, but we've also reported on stories where it was triggered when someone was on a roller coaster,
or skiing.
Or skiing. And so if what the new news that came out is Apple is saying that if you do call 911 or whatever the emergency services are in your part of the world, don't just hang up. You know, you might think, oh, it was a mistake, I'll just hang up on them. But if you hang up on them, 911 will usually say there's a problem and go through the trouble of sending out police to try to help you out. So they say, stay on the line, talk to them, explain that it was a mistake.
Yes.
And then once they understand it's a mistake. And my understanding is that 911 folks are smart enough that, let's say, for example, someone was holding you at gunpoint or something horrible like that. If you accidentally call 911, you might say like, everything's fine here. I'm doing fine here on Main Street, where, you might be able to give subtle hints to the 911 person that things are actually not fine. So they're trained to listen and decide if they should send someone out there. But if it truly is a mistake, just explain to them what happened. And that way, nobody wants to be responsible for sending emergency folks out unnecessarily when they have more important things to be doing.
Right. And we've reported on stories. In fact, I think they reference it here, that emergency dispatchers around ski slopes have been particularly unhappy with how many accidental calls are happening. And, nobody wants to have the time and expense of them going out to find that there's nothing going on there. So just stay on, let everybody know it's okay. Don't send anybody, don't go through all that. Just a quick bonus tip this made me think of. Somebody asked me the other day on their phone, they said, instead of the cell bars or the 5G symbol at the very top right corner, that they said sometimes it says SOS. Why does it say SOS on there? And just so, in case anybody knows about that, that basically means that you may not have cell service for your particular provider, but if you made an SOS call, that I think from the FCC requires that no matter what cell tower is around you, that call will go through. Does that sound accurate on that, Jeff?
Yep. So if I subscribe to AT&T and I am out in the wilderness and there's only a T-Mobile or Verizon tower, I won't be able to use it to make a phone call, but I still can use it to dial 911.
Good. Excellent. So if you see that SOS there, in fact, I was just hiking in the Smoky Mountains last week. Now, I have an iPhone 14 Pro, so not only did it say SOS, it had a little tiny satellite icon on there as well, which also tells me, because we've talked about this, that because I have an iPhone 14 Pro, that not only could it make an SOS call on any cell tower, but it could also do a satellite, what do they call it? The emergency satellite system, I believe. On there. So anyway, just a little additional FYI that even if you don't have cell service for your cell service, that you can still make an SOS call. Click on this right now. I think you've mentioned the Clicker 2.0 Apple Watch app in the past, Jeff. I didn't get it, but I'm getting it today. I love this.
Yeah, it's just a cute little idea for an Apple Watch app. The new update is the 2.0, but I mentioned the 1.0 in the past, that it's just a very simple app that if you just need to count things, whatever it is that you're counting, if you're counting laps, so you're sitting there counting different things as they happen. Somebody said that they used it to count the number of trick-or-treaters in their house, but it's just a way you can just tap it. Every time you tap your watch, the number increases by 1, and you can set up a little complication to launch it quickly. But if you're just doing anything in life where you might want to keep track of the number of things of something, this is a simple little app that does it. It's free. It's not it's got a very clean interface, but it's a nice app and it works. And so I recommend it.
Yeah, I think they said that they just made the plus button a little bit bigger, that you can tap, and you've mentioned that you can just hit the little minus sign if you wanted to take one away. And they've got a nice little small list here about what you can use it for. Laps while running on a track. I got to tell you, sometimes I run around our high school football track, Jeff, and I wish I'd have known about this, or I was using this before, because what I do is I put my fingers around my thumb to indicate to myself what number lap that I'm on. And it's like, hey, I got an Apple Watch. I'm already using the Apple Watch anyway. I could just go ahead and do that. But people say you can use the number of books read. Just real quick, does it keep track of the number, Jeff, even when you go out of the app, or can you have several different counters on there as well?
You can't have several counters, and you can only count one number. So you can't use it to keep track of scores in a game because it can't keep track of two numbers, just one. But it does sync across devices so that if you're counting on your watch, you could then go back and count on your phone. So nice. I mean, it doesn't have to be something that you're counting this hour. It could be something that you're counting over the course of many weeks if you want.
Okay, and this is from the developer or one of the owners of Icon Factory, which makes some really, really nice apps, both for Mac and for the iPhone and everything else as well, which is great. Who knew that Siri could talk back so well? This is a great list. I feel like we should try some of these. 129 Siri Easter eggs to get a surprise response from Apple's smart assistant. There's all kinds of little questions. Some of these I knew. Like I remember from the very beginning, you could say, she's already listening. Hey Siri, will you marry me? Let's see if she responds here. I think she's listening. That was hey Siri, tell me a riddle.
What's in my pocket? Oh wait, I don't have pockets.
Okay, that's really
very
appropriate.
Funny riddle.
But there's a lot here. Like you could ask all kinds of things. Why did Apple make you? What is the best computer? I wonder how they're going to answer that. Can find me directions to Mordor? Ooh, I like that. Hey Siri, find me directions to Mordor.
If you want to get rid of a ring, try asking me to find a pawn shop.
Oh, very good. Okay, interesting. Thanks for linking to this, Jeff. Now I've got something to do for the next 3 hours.
Whenever you want to waste some time, you have a big list of things to go through here.
This is good. It's good to find that these Easter eggs. I'm glad that who was this that put it together? John Anthony DeSoto. Thank you. This on imore.com, and we'll link to that as well. In the know. Another thing that I was doing this past week was traversing back and forth between the Central Time Zone and the Eastern Time Zone. I was driving back and forth across Kentucky and then in Texas and different states as I was traveling this past week, Jeff. And it was just a little frustrating at a couple of times about my appointments, just making sure that I was on time. I was trying to link to a New York Times article here, but it looks like that it's blocking me, but I'll just explain it real quick. There's a couple of things that the iPhone does and does very well. Because it's connecting to cell phone towers, most of the time your iPhone will update itself to the current time of whatever time zone that you're in, right? So when you're driving across a time zone, or when you're flying and you land and you reconnect, get out of airplane mode, it'll find the correct time, which is fantastic. And by the way, you can find that setting. If you don't want that to work for some reason, you can go into your settings, go into general, and go to date and time. And you'll see there that there is a toggle that you can set the time zone automatically. And so basically that means the iPhone will grab the current time from whatever cell tower that you're in, whatever current time zone that you're in. You can toggle that off, and you can say, I don't want you to change time zones, and I want you to stay in the current time zone. So that's really for the iPhone, the general iPhone itself. However, when I check my calendar for appointments, like I need to fly to Chicago, right? And they're in Central Time Zone from where I am in the Eastern Time Zone. Sometimes I want my calendar to stay in an Eastern Time Zone, or sometimes I want it to update. Most of the time, I would just leave it updated. That's a little bit of a different setting. You can go into settings and you scroll all the way down in settings until you go to calendar. And then in the calendar settings, there is an option called time zone override. Now, you can leave this off, which means that the calendar will show the current time zone of wherever you are, right? Which is helpful. So here's what typically happens and why that I leave mine off. Because if I set a meeting while I am in Eastern time, and I say that meeting is going to be at 3 p.m., right? It's going to actually be 2 p.m. on Central Time. So when I fly to Chicago, I want my calendar to reflect that the meeting is now 2 p.m. Central Time as opposed to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I know a lot of this is kind of rudimentary, but I find some people get confused about it, including myself fairly frequently on this. Now, if you wanted your calendar to stay in a certain time zone, you could toggle on time zone override, which means then you can tell your phone, I want my calendar to stay in like the Eastern time zone, right? Even when I go to the Central time zone, my iPhone will say the correct time in Central time zone, but my calendar will stay in the Eastern time zone. Why you want this, I'm not sure, but I will tell you, somebody was telling me the other day that they wanted it to act like a paper calendar. So if they have a paper calendar, they write it in Eastern time zone at 3 p.m. And when they go to the Central time zone, they want it to still be at 3 p.m. just because of the way that they think. And I get that and I understand. So anyway, that's my tip. I just wanted to point that out. I prefer leaving my calendar with the time zone override toggled off so that my calendar will update to whatever the current time zone is that I'm in. And by the way, in my calendar, what I also appreciate is that 3 p.m. Eastern appointment will now be at 2 p.m. Eastern, but there will be a parentheses in the appointment that says 3 p.m. EDT, Eastern Daylight Time, right? Yeah. So in other words, for me at least, that is how I can navigate the different time zones. For other people, I know that gets a little frustrating and confusing, and so they may want the iPhone time to update, but they may not want their calendar to update with the times. And if that is where you sit, then you can go into settings, calendar, and you can toggle on the time zone override, or you can leave it turned off so that everything updates. Even then, I realize this is a lot of explanation and it still is very confusing to me many times in doing it, but it did save my bacon when I was traveling this past week because I was able to make sure that I was where I was supposed to be when I was supposed to be there based on the current time zone in which I was working in there. That's important. My tip today. Important. Time zone override toggle. Thank you.
Good one. My tip has to do with, if all over the news the last couple of months, we've had from OpenAI, the ChatGPT, and you hear so many people talking about, the ways that it can have these intelligent discussions with you. Just a few minutes ago, we were talking about things that you can talk to Siri about, tell me a joke or something simple like that. Right. But I think we've all seen examples of how ChatGPT is far more sophisticated. Based upon its index of the entire internet from a few years ago, it can answer a whole host of questions. And so if you want to play around with it, Federico Viticci, the person behind Mac Stories, who is incredible with shortcuts on the iPhone and on the iPad, he came up with a shortcut called S, just for shortcuts, S-GPT, that you can download for free and you can put it in your Shortcuts app. Now you need to connect it to a paid OpenAI account, but you can go to the OpenAI website and if you give them a credit card, the accounts, you need to pay for searches, but they're like fractions of a penny for the search. And so you can go in and say, like, have an account and, stop if I go over $5 or $10 or so. You're not really spending a lot of money and you probably won't. Federico says that he's been using this for a month and he spent like $1.50. So you're not going to spend a lot of money on it. But the shortcut is neat because it's a good way to sort of give you a sense. In my mind, it's sort of like a sense of what Siri might be like in the future as it gets even smarter. And so I'm opening up on my phone right now. I'm just tapping the shortcut and it says, what do you want to ask? And it's a place I can type in some text, but of course I can hit the microphone button. I can talk to it. So one way that you can use these open AI systems is you can ask them factual questions. And infamously, they are sometimes very accurate, but sometimes not so much. So I'm going to try right now to say, and I did not tell you I was going to do this. Who is Brett Burney? So I just asked, who is Brett Burney? And so my shortcut is doing its thing. It's going through OpenAI. And here's what it says. Brett Burney is a legal technology consultant. That's true. Who helps lawyers and law firms implement technology solutions to improve their practice. True. He is also a popular speaker and author in the legal technology field. That was all 100% accurate. So it did a good job, right?
And I'm also the nephew of Tim Cook. Make sure it says that.
It did not say that. I asked the same question about myself because I am a little bit of a narcissist.
Yes.
And it had a similar answer. It talked about my iPhone JD website. Now, it also mentioned that I've authored a number of books. I actually have not authored any books, at least not
really. Congratulations, Jeff.
Although when you add up all the words that I've written on iPhone JD over the last 13 years, it probably is, an encyclopedia. But that's one thing that you can ask. And again, infamously, you can't always trust the answers. But when you ask things that are more subjective, you can actually get some pretty interesting results. And so, for example, I asked it things like, come up with an agenda for a 3-day vacation in New Orleans. What should I do? Because I know New Orleans. And like just on day one, it says you should start off with beignets in the morning at Cafe Du Monde. An excellent solution. You should go to the French Quarter and take a walking tour, explore the art galleries on Royal Street, have a drink at the famous Carousel Bar at the Hotel Monteleone. And let me just pause there. This is one of my favorite things to do with tourists is to go to the Carousel Bar. You spin around and you have, that's a great thing. Then it says end up the day with jazz music at Preservation Hall. That's a great agenda. And then it goes on with the other days and good stuff. And so that's pretty good stuff. And but if you read the article, Federici describes some of the things that he specifically enabled in here. And again, things that are more subjective, where it's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. This ChatGPT technology can be great for giving you ideas and sort of starting points and things.
Starting points, exactly. Yep.
One thing that Federico specifically made this work with is music, because he loves music. And so, for example, if I ask Siri to create a playlist for me, Siri can't do that. But if you use this system, it actually can do it. And so this morning, 2 minutes before our call, I was like, okay, I turned this thing on and I said, make me a playlist of the top 10 songs by members of the Beatles that were created after they left the Beatles. I didn't know what there was going to be. And, within a few minutes, I have a playlist that's in my Apple Music app. I can play it right now.
Really?
And it's got, Maybe I'm Amazed by Paul McCartney, Imagine by John Lennon, Band on the Run by Paul McCartney and Wings, Instant Karma by John Lennon, Photograph by Ringo Starr. These Live and Let Die by Wings, these are all great songs. Now I might argue that most, but it is absolutely a good list, good playlist.
Right.
You might argue that maybe I might put this one higher or lower, and they forgot this, or they shouldn't have included this. But it's at least exactly. It's at least a starting point. And this is, again, my point here is it's a fun shortcut to play with. It's a fun way for you to play around with ChatGPT. But I really see it as the future of these smart assistants like Siri, that they're going to be able to give you a whole lot more advice on a whole lot of things. Now, I will tell you before I finish up, as a lawyer, I cannot open a legal technology magazine without someone writing the article of here's how ChatGPT is going to change the legal industry. I don't know if it's going to do that. It's going to have some implications here and there. I think some of that's just sort of fluff. It's sort of like, years ago, people were like, here's how Bitcoin is going to change the legal industry. Well, I don't know about that.
Good point,
It's
Jeff.
just the technology of the day. But I'll give you one more, for instance, that this can do. ChatGPT is very good at summarizing things. And so if you select a block of text, like a big page or two of text, and then you open up this shortcut, and if you just say the word clipboard, and then hit return, it will take whatever on the clipboard and it will summarize it into a few sentences. Now, keep in mind, it's not doing this on device. It's sending it to OpenIA server and then bringing it back. So if this is private information, if you're a lawyer, or if you're a doctor, it's HIPAA information, you probably don't want to do that. But if you just want to summarize a book or summarize, a page, what is this web page talking about? It actually does a pretty good job with that. And this is just using the ChatGPT 3.5 technology. I don't have access to ChatGPT 4, which is supposed to be many times better. So, again, great preview of the future that you can play around with on your iPhone, on your iPad. It's pretty cool stuff. And I know that in the future, technology like this will be just a part of our lives. But for now, I feel like I'm, living on the edge, getting a preview of what the future is like by playing around with this stuff.
I like how he has a comparison here between asking something similar, shuffling the top songs. He's asking ChatGPT versus asking Siri to do it. And he just says, "Oh, Siri, it's just not working. You're just not doing as good of a job on there." Oh my goodness, thank you for highlighting this, Jeff. I can't wait. I've just dabbled a little bit, which I'm sure most people that are listening to us have at least dabbled or tried ChatGPT, and they certainly have heard about some of the fun stuff that you can do with it and the amazing stuff that you can do with it. But man, this kind of like puts it in your hand, as it were, right? I've just gone to the free website, just like everybody else, and sometimes this is not even available. But man, just having this in the shortcut on your phone, I can't wait. Thanks for highlighting that, and thank you, Federico. My goodness, man, you're just like always on the cutting edge.
Oh, seriously, this is such a sophisticated shortcut. I can't even imagine, creating something like this as a shortcut. It's so sophisticated and complicated.
And let's see, he does allow you to download it, right? He usually
at the very end of the article, you can download it for free.
Okay.
Again, you're going to have to pay a dollar or two to, you have to give him a credit card for OpenAI. That's not giving it to him. That's giving it to the people that run the searches. But his shortcuts are completely free to download. Yeah.
Fantastic, Jeff. Thanks for joining this week. Now, next week we're going to take off. But we'll be back the week after. Exactly. And so we'll talk with you in 2 weeks then.
Thanks, Brett. Bye-bye, everybody.